Greetings, welcome to the joint Transforming Assessment and Assessment in Higher Education Network webinar for October 2025. The topic today is Rethinking Assessment, a Balancing Act. And James, would you like to do the honours of introducing, please?
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome. I'm James from Durham University, and hosting today on behalf of the AHE Network, and that stands for Assessment for Learning in Higher Education. My co-host Fabio is also here. As you can see on the slides, and we're absolutely delighted to be here with you for what promises to be a fascinating session on rethinking assessment in the age of AI, the Balancing Act. For those new to AHE, we are an independent network focused on developing research-informed practice and assessment and feedback. We're hosted by the LED Research Centre at the University of Canberra, but we bring together practitioners and researchers from across all disciplines and professional fields. And today's talk is exactly the kind of critical, cutting-edge conversation we exist to facilitate. Speaking of conversations, mark your calendars for our AHE conference 2026. We'll be in Manchester on June 18th and 19th with keynotes, peer-reviewed presentations, and masterclasses from leading experts. We get a really good mix of people from all over the world. We've got a lot of great colleagues that come over from Australia as well, and Hong Kong. And so if today's session inspires you, we'd love to receive your abstract by January 19th, 2026. And this is where the assessment community really comes together to push the boundaries of assessment practice. So our two brilliant speakers today are tackling the questions that we're all grappling with. First, we have Adjunct Associate Professor Elaine Huber from the University of Sydney, and she'll explore balancing innovation and integrity, rethinking assessment design in the age of generative AI. Then we have Assistant Professor Jess Luo from Education University of Hong Kong, who's asking the provocative question, what does originality actually mean in student assignments in the generative AI age? So these are the kinds of conversations that we love to have at AHE. So without further ado, let me hand over to Elaine. We've got about 15 minutes to speak. If there's any burning questions, we may have time to answer them. Otherwise, we'll do most of the questions at the end. So Elaine, over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Matthew, for the invitation to come along and present to everybody today. I am presenting on behalf of a lovely big research team. You can see all of their faces at the bottom of the screen. I'm the one on the far left, and I would like to acknowledge their input to this project and to this research that's been spanning a number of years now. We've presented a couple of times at the AHE conference, most recently this year, and I'm also a member of, I'm the Vice President actually of Ask Aloud, for those of you who know it. But to begin, I would like to pay to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. Our research was carried out on Gadigal lands, the people of the Eora Nation, and I'm currently living and working on Wangal lands. And I do acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about our project. The main project I'm going to talk to you about today is based on a project that we started back in 2022, so before AI came onto the scene. And for that project, we've got a paper that you can read if you want, if you're interested. But what we were interested in doing initially was to find out from educators what was important to them when they were designing their assessment tasks. And this sort of came out of, as we came out of COVID, the COVID years, as we're now calling them. And we were trying to find out, we were particularly looking at online assessments, but I'm sure you all agree almost all assessments are online these days or have an element of digital. And what we did was we worked with educators primarily with surveys and focus groups, and we wanted to sort of investigate what were the elements that were important. I'm not going to go into each of the elements in any detail for this presentation, but happy to answer questions in the chat later if you have them. So we from that initial project, we came out with these sort of 6 indicators. So academic integrity, obviously most important, student experience, you know, how to improve the student experience, make assessments authentic, take into account student privacy of student data and information integrity, particularly if you think about it around when we were in COVID with the proctoring of assessments, and then obviously there's lots of research and information you can find out there on the importance of quality feedback. And there was this other factor as well, which we termed equity of access, which I'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about AI in a bit. But we also had sort of around the outside, sort of encompassing these with these sort of constraints, if you like, of things that were a little bit, I guess, beyond academics' control in a sense. So obviously their assessment designs had to meet institutional policies. They had to think about how to scale up assessments. Resourcing often was, you know, restrictive in terms of both time, money, people. And because we were originally all from a business school at the University of Sydney and the University of Technology, Sydney, we were also interested in accreditation. And there's plenty of other disciplines who have constraints put on them by accreditation requirements. So what we found was, you know, obviously there's no assessment unicorn. It's unlikely that you're going to do all of these things perfectly when you design an assessment. But we hoped that our sort of framework could provide educators and assessment designers with the opportunity to consider what they needed to perhaps trade off when thinking about all of these different elements and designing their assessments. So what this paper or this presentation today did or will explain to you is a little bit about how generative AI sort of impacts or what impacts it's had on decisions made by educators in their assessment design. So I'm going to skip wildly through the next set of slides and not talk to them. I've just got them there, then you'll get them in the pack after the thing, but it's just a little bit more about the background behind each of those elements that I've mentioned. So I'll just move us to, yeah, just a quick summary. So what we found in that original, when we were looking at how people go about designing their assessments, what we found was, you know, these assessment decisions or these design decisions were really made in isolation. You know, at the end of the day, our educators told us the buck stops with them, and, you know, they have to be comfortable with their assessment design. They have to be able to manage it. They have to be able to resource it. They have to carry it out and take responsibility for whether it works or not. And because one of the things we were originally trying to do is find out about innovation in assessment and what could we do differently and what were the options and what were the possibilities. But we found a very low a very low tolerance for innovation, mainly because of the risk and because it's high stakes. We also acknowledge that there are plenty of assessment committees who give feedback and advice and ensure alignment with policies, etc. But rarely do they get involved in the design. And as I said, we found that educators were cautious to take innovation, to implement innovation in assessment. Particularly around workload, we found that people said there just wasn't time to try something new. If they did, we found it tended to be low weighting assessments, and mainly academics tended to stick with the more traditional approaches and styles. So we hoped that our framework, through developing it and having conversations and then presenting it and sharing it widely, that we could start to sort of, give people things to think about and talk about, elements to discuss within their own disciplines, across the university and across the sector. And sort of answer questions and offer advice and support around assessment design. So that was sort of our aim of the initial project. And then I won't go into that in too much detail. We basically created a framework and some of the benefits of frameworks. So what we then decided to do was, that was all based on educators' experience. And so what we then wanted to do was move on to sort of validating that framework, see whether we'd missed anything by talking to other stakeholders, I suppose, in the assessment design practice. So we really wanted to get some feedback from students about what they felt about assessment design. We wanted to, go back to educators to validate the framework. We also talked to industry experts, particularly people in industry who work with universities, who might give projects to universities, who might come and do panel presentations, that sort of thing. We talked with some institutional decision makers particularly around that policy aspect. And we talked also to accreditation body representatives to find out what was important to them in the whole assessment, and what thoughts did they have around assessment. And because it was now 2024, when we did this, we started asking the questions about GenAI, how is it impacting their assessment design, and what impact, or how did GenAI interact with the elements of our framework. So we did a survey, some focus groups, and some interviews across Australia. So what did we find? Lots of interesting things, obviously, quite a variety and often conflicting experiences and impacts of GenAI on the assessment practices. We do have a full paper coming out with lots more detail of this shortly, hopefully. But pros and cons, like most things in anything related to learning and teaching. We found that some people really saw benefit from GenAI and how it could perhaps improve efficiencies, how it could be used with feedback. I won't go into too much details in regards to ethical issues there. But then there was also the risk, obviously, to academic integrity, and also equity of access. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Very divergent views across the different stakeholder groups. Lots of calls for return to traditional pen and paper exams. Others really wanting to be more innovative, wanted to leverage this new technology, this sort of different approaches where they could. Students really were, when we were collecting this data, probably almost a year ago, a little bit over a year ago now, really aware about GenAI, and plenty of them were using it, but also very aware of the negatives and the challenges around using it. But they really were looking for more guidance. And I think we've moved a long way since we collected this data anyway in Australia around, and I'll talk again more about that a little bit towards the end. But really wanting, I think students wanted more guardrails, more advice about how they should and could use it. Interesting, again, that sort of the institutional requirements and accreditation requirements usually came out as barriers, but occasionally there were examples people shared with us of how some forward-thinking institutions were actually enabling better assessment design or helping academics understand what they could and couldn't do. So the next slide has got a sort of a little bit of I've kind of listed the participants, the stakeholder groups down the left, and there's 3 of our elements across the top there. There's lots to talk about, and I don't really have many more minutes. I'll just highlight a couple of things. So we're particularly interested in hearing from our industry experts and them telling us how they were starting to think about how they used AI in the workplace, and how they were hoping that students would come to them with some knowledge of different AI tools, and looking for the students to bring new ideas almost into the workplace on how they could drive. Usually it was around efficiencies, but again, we were very much talking with business school connections, industry connections, and students and staff. But they also questioned about access and how the universities were giving students access to these tools. In terms of when we spoke to students, we got some fascinating insights into their thoughts, their fears, their wants and their needs. You know, students told us they liked to use GenAI for instantaneous feedback to get to find out how they could improve their work, but also acknowledging that they knew it was wrought with mistakes. But they, you know, many of you will have now institutional agentic tools that students that we spoke to here in Australia started to use, and they really liked when the GenAI could give them that sort of guidance and manage their expectations. Back then, which, as I say, was over a year ago now, educators were saying that GenAI was great to help them design more authentic tasks, because it was a time-saving exercise. But I think we've moved a little bit away from that now, and people are starting to question how authentic the tasks are, and whether actually it doesn't stop just because it's more authentic, doesn't actually combat the academic integrity issues that have been arising. Whereas I think we thought maybe back then that would do it, but as we know, GenAI has gotten much more clever. And in terms of those constraints that I mentioned to you earlier, just a little sort of an overview there of some of the points that were made to us. So, you know, in terms of resourcing, there was concerns around providing equitable access to GenAI, and that could be prohibitive for some institutions, particularly you know, in the current sort of financial climate of many institutions not having that funding to be able to equitably provide access to AI tools. In terms of scaling up, you know, the educators very concerned about the ethical implications of using GenAI, and, you know, were back then really looking for policies and guidelines. Programmatic assessment was being touted at that point as the answer to scale an AI, but I think even now, a year on, we're still only starting to see baby steps made forward towards that. We obviously were, as I mentioned, we're interested in accreditation. Our institutional policymakers sort of commented that accreditation requirements sometimes reflected outdated views of what was required in industry, you know, and it was really changing now with AI, and that was what was inhibiting the innovation in disciplines where they had accreditation requirements. And yet accreditation bodies sort of noted to us that they found sometimes their industry-based assessors struggled to adopt new approaches, and that was what was inhibiting them of offering or accepting more innovative assessment approaches. In Australia, our regulator, TEXA, the Quality Standards group, has sort of had a flow-on effect to university policies, and they've most recently published a new set of guidelines on how to enact assessment reform in the times of AI, and I can share a link with that to that for you later if that's of interest. So I know I'm running out of time. Oh yeah, I've gone over. So just in conclusion, I guess I think we found that GenAI has definitely been a bigger disruptor than, say, COVID-19 was, where, you know, when COVID was over, in inverted commas, a lot of people just returned to their sort of old practices, if you like, their assessment practices. But with GenAI, there's no real going backwards. It's really only going forward. And our research did demonstrate that, you know, designing and adjusting your assessment, it is a challenging and a complex process, and it is often done in isolation. But, you know, we hope that people can rise to the challenge and sort of leverage the potential of GenAI, but mitigate the risks, and then really think about the trade-offs that they can make based on our framework elements. So I've got a slide about future implications, but I won't go into that because I've run out of time. I will leave you with this slide, which, if you're interested, we did present. Amanda White presented this research at the recent AskAlike conference. You can get the paper there if you want it. We do have a journal article in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. And we do have a website as well that where we collected lots of innovative ideas for online assessment. And thanks again to my research team and to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was brilliant. So we are at 8:23, so we might have time for a question or two if anybody's got a burning question they'd like to ask. And feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go along as well, and I'll loop back to them. I've got a question about traditional assessment methods versus preparing students for AI-driven workplaces. We're having this debate at Durham as well, and I'm wondering where the data suggested we should start with that. You know, should we change the task so students are practicing AI skills, or should we go back to the learning objectives and kind of reevaluate those and start from there? Did you get any interesting data on that?
Thanks, James. We didn't really get, you know, specifics about where to start, I guess, because we were focusing more on our elements and asking them how they felt about the elements and how GenAI was impacting on those elements particularly. But from experience or from observations that I've seen across a number of other institutions is that I think people are starting to, well, you've probably heard about the two-lane approach, where there's a, you know, they're kind of now identifying assessments that are secure and assessments that are not secure, and that by having a number of secure assessment points across the curriculum and across the program or the degree, that is going to be a stronger way moving forward of doing assessment. Trying to move, I mean, we all know that we over assess. You know, you think about here in Australia, we tend to, in a semester, a student in one semester, you'd have 4 different subjects. Each subject will have at least 3 assessments. So you've got a minimum 12 assessments, probably up to 16 or 17 assessments per semester. It's a lot of assessment, and you couldn't possibly secure all of those assessments. So it's more about, I would say, looking at the course level learning outcomes rather than the subject or unit level or module, I think you call it in the UK, level learning outcomes, and thinking about where are those secure points, and what can you do about them? How can you make the ones that are not secure perhaps more innovative and more sort of formative, feedback and interactive?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have one more question from Jackie, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions later on, but we should move on after this one. So Jackie asks, you talk about a trade-off between innovation and integrity. Is this at the level of a task, or does it relate to programmatic assessment? Where is your thinking on how to balance the quantity and range of secure and open assessments?
It's a pity I haven't got my camera on. Jackie could see me smiling. I know Jackie well. Hello, Jackie. Thank you for your question. So our research was, I would say, definitely, like, as I said, over a year ago, and people were still thinking of the task level. And I think because of the people we were asking, so the individual educators were talking to us about their own assessments at their sort of subject level and their individual tasks. Whereas the group that we spoke to, the leaders, the sort of policymakers, the heads of the university, were starting to think much more at the programmatic, the higher level. And so, yeah, so I guess it depended who we were talking to, but I think overall, students particularly were thinking more at the task level as well when they spoke to us. But in terms of what my thing is on how to balance the quantity and range of secure and open, this is a great source of debate at the moment across Australia, I think. And I've seen, so if you're doing programmatic, it's kind of, you want to have at least one, so each of your subject, unit, module, how you call it, at least one secure assessment from each of those. But how many unsecure items of assessment you have would be, I guess, up to the designers. But yeah, I would say at least one at each, or at least one at each module/unit level, and definitely at least, so that theoretically could be 8 per year level, if you like, sort of course level, like year 1, 2, 3. But even that seems like a lot. But I couldn't imagine you would get any academics saying, well, you don't need to do any secure assessment in my module or my unit. So it's a good question, and one that's open for more debate. And I assume other people have thoughts on that too.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Perhaps we can loop back to that discussion after Jess has finished the presentation. So thank you, and Jess, over to you.
All right, so hello everyone. My name is Jess. I'm from the Education University of Hong Kong. So thank you very much for having me today. It's great to join this webinar and to join this conversation. So we've been talking about generative AI for a while. And here on the screen, we can see some screenshots of documents, right? And they're often known as the AI use declaration form, where students are supposed to declare their AI use before submitting work for assessment. I think this is now common practice in Hong Kong across universities, and I believe globally as well. If we take a closer look at these declaration forms, as you can see in the red columns here, we would often notice a recurring emphasis for students to produce their original work or their own work. They are telling students to distinguish their original work from the AI-assisted process. Actually, this whole emphasis on producing original work is not new in higher education. I remember that many years ago when I did my undergraduate thesis, I need to declare something like, this is my original thesis, I need to sign an originality statement, and this is exactly done with my independent efforts and all that. And we are also all very familiar with Turnitin. And actually, every time when it scans an essay, it generates a report. And that particular report is called the originality report. So we can see that this emphasis and this concept of originality is all over in our discourse and our policies in higher education. And there were many important reasons for these. But as generative AI becomes increasingly powerful in shaping students' work process, sometimes I just couldn't help but ask, so we're telling students to have original thinking, you need to produce original work, it's all over in our policy papers, student handbook. But what do we exactly mean by original work? And how is original work currently framed and understood in relation to AI use? So with these questions, earlier last year, I did a critical AI policy review. It's a very long paper, but one of my major findings is that in the current policy framing, AI is often viewed as a type of external assistance that is separate from the student's independent efforts and intellectual contribution. So when I look at the policy database, we notice quite a few instances where the policies imply a clear distinction between AI-generated text and original text. For example, on the right-hand side, students are asked to differentiate between the ChatGPT text and text that is actually original. And in the policy language, we also see that AI use is often treated no differently from outsourcing the coursework to a third party like your friends or the ghost writers. So the data tell us two things. One is by original work, there seems to be an implication in the current policies that this refers to students' work produced by themselves without the assistance of AI or others. So producing original work and using AI seems to be like two things in conflict. And number two is the originality of students' work is mainly framed as a concern of cheating or academic misconduct. So if your work has somehow been tampered with by AI, then this is not your original work, and this could constitute a violation of academic integrity. So students' work without any AI involvement is often considered more original and hence more aligned with the values underpinning academic integrity. And you can see that I'm putting a big question mark here. Is such understanding problematic, and why? I think we might have a clearer answer to that question as we navigate question number 2. So is it feasible for us to clearly separate original work and AI use? My argument is that the notion that students' AI use is separate from their independent effort and original work is actually predicated on a quite simplistic assumption that our students, they simply copy and paste AI-generated content into their assignments and pass it off as their own. However, some of the empirical data from my study suggest otherwise. This is a semester-long study I did with my student, and then we traced university undergraduate authentic dialogues with AI, and then we wanted to see under unsupervised settings, how are they using AI to support their assessment. And then we look at their chat records, and then we do bi-weekly interviews with them. So one of the findings is that we found some skilled students, they were quite able to conduct really extended dialogues with AI over multiple iterations. So when we look at their chat record, it's really very rich. There are multiple rounds going on. So there is evidence for very strong metacognitive regulation and agency when we see how they guided AI's output step by step towards their desired direction. So when we say that many universities, when they require students to clearly distinguish between original work and the AI-assisted content, in this context and from this perspective, such requirements are not only difficult to achieve, but may even be unreasonable or misleading. Because ironically, if a student can easily make such distinctions, I can tell you, well, this part is AI generated and this part is written on my own, it might suggest that their use of AI lacks the very iterative, very agentic engagement that characterizes more sophisticated AI use. Actually, even very long before this recent hype around AI, some scholars, they have pointed out that nothing is wholly original, because we as humans, we think and write by remixing and reusing the past, adding to or remaking old plots, insights, and ideas. And the rise of AI absolutely further complicates the process of producing original work. And here on the slides, we can see a model by Professor Sarah Eaton from Calgary University in Canada. And some of you might be very familiar with her work, and I love this model a lot. So in his conceptualization of post-plagiarism era, there are 6 key tenets. And the number one tenet Sarah proposed was that hybrid human AI writing will become normal. And she argues that AI generated texts are not static, but are often edited, revised, reworked, and remixed by humans, making it difficult to draw the line between human and AI contributions. And this also corresponds with some of the empirical data that we have when we investigated how students actually engage with AI for assessment purposes. So, and then I started to think, well, if it is not feasible to clearly distinguish this thing, then is it desirable to emphasize originality as purely human work without any AI involvement? When we look at the academic literature, there's an emerging line of studies that are highlighting a growing sense of anxiety among students regarding AI use in their coursework for assessment. And China has done a wonderful paper on student non-compliance in AI declaration. And a year ago, I also interviewed some students, and then I look into how GenAI affects teacher-student relationships. And as we interacted with students, here are some of the quotes we got from our interviews. Some students said, well, what if the professor thinks I've used too much AI? Would this put me at a disadvantage? The teacher may feel you're not independent enough, your language skills are poor, or even you've used AI to write most parts of the assignments. Some students are too scared, and then they turn off all AI tools when they do their assignments. So when we look at the student quotes and all these data, even across studies, fear, and very prominent fear, is a very important theme that emerged in our research. And behind such fear, again, there's an implied hierarchy, which is very similar to the findings that we found in our policy paper. That is, work that is thoroughly human is understood, or often understood, to be more original and valued, whereas AI collaborative work, well, they may be useful, but less authentic. So under this context and then this discourse, students who use AI, they could be stigmatized regardless of how they use it. They could be perceived as less independent, less capable, or less ethical. And these studies also found that some students, they intentionally refuse to use AI in their assignments or to engage with AI in their learning. Here on the slide, you see there's a website called Humanize AI. This is a website that one of my students shared with me. And then he said that a lot of his peers are using this kind of website, an AI-powered platform, which purported to help students make their test appear more original using AI technology. So we do sense the sarcasm here. So it's actually quite sad that a lot of students, they end up spending more time to ensure their work is not flagged by these AI detectors as unoriginal, or to avoid being seen as unoriginal, rather than spending time to really meaningfully engage in their learning or assignments. As for teachers, we also did a study on Reddit post, and then we found that a lot of teachers have complained about being forced into the role of AI police in this process, trying to fix which work is original, which work is AI generated, rather than educators fulfilling their role to nurture learning. I may not have enough time for this, but I want to highlight a few important things when we think about and talk about some pathways forward. The number one thing I want to emphasize is about the ingrained value orientation towards originality and AI shaming phenomenon. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see an old man, like he's reading and writing in a kind of a attic room. In 2007, Johnson, Ilola, and Sauber, in their article about defining original work in writing, they argue that there is an implied hierarchy. The best of a writer's work is always associated with this idea of a lone genius in the attic, slaving away on a piece of written work. And they argue that students sometimes, they intentionally refuse to make attributions to source text because of this kind of implied hierarchy. This is connected to the 18th century Copyright Act. So by explicitly recognizing authors as original holders of rights to their work, and then originality is kind of connected to the concept of intellectual property, and then transform authors into really independent agents in the literary marketplace. So we see that many years ago, and this kind of value hierarchy still very subtly shapes public perceptions of what we mean and what we value as original work. And I think a lot of these are also connected to a broader phenomenon, the AI shaming phenomenon. Jiahui had this very good paper, which he defines AI shaming as dismissing the validity or authenticity of AI-assisted work, suggesting that using AI is deceitful, lazy, or less valuable than human only. And in this paper, one of his major argument is that this whole value hierarchy, this AI shaming phenomenon here, remains a silent stigma. It very subtly shapes how we perceive AI-assisted work, but it's seldom addressed directly. In a recent paper we did that we look at teachers' value judgments in grading, we found that a lot of these value hierarchies, they are sometimes even not recognized by teachers, researchers, and policymakers themselves. We found that some teachers, despite describing themselves as really open and supportive of AI use in their discipline, but when it comes to the actual grading process, they instinctively rank coursework without any AI involvement higher, viewing it as a reflection of greater independence, originality, and capability. So we do think that these issues around these implied value hierarchy of what we mean by original work, they need to be more explicitly discussed in our current conversation. So the second point I want to mention is about rethinking originality through the lens of validity. So every time when we talk about this, I would get questions like, well, Jess, you said we should recognize AI in producing original work, but what about academic integrity? Like, when does AI use compromise originality and when it does not? And when can students claim this is their original work and when they can't? These are a set of really challenging, difficult questions. But I found this paper on the lens of validity by a group of Cradle scholars really helpful when we try to think about or tackle these questions. So what they argue in the paper is that when we think about these difficult questions, we need to think about the validity issue, i.e. what our assessment is intended to assess. So from the perspective of validity, the use of AI could compromise the originality of students' work if it prevents the student from demonstrating the outcomes the assessment is designed to measure. For example, in an English writing course, a lecturer may not consider a student's work to be original if AI was used for language polishing, because this would interfere with what is considered the student's authentic original contribution to the assignment. But we can imagine that if this is put in another course or assignment context, language polishing that may or may not be a core part for what constitutes original contribution of this student. And here at the pink sticker, I put a small note here. The scholars, I guess, in other disciplines may have different opinions, especially when it comes to intellectual property angles. But here, when we are talking about this issue from assessment, and I think validity could be a pathway for us to consider these originality issues. And finally, the final point I want to say is about changing the discourse from a police catch-punish focus to supporting student development. As I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the originality of students' work, is often mainly framed as a concern of cheating or academic misconduct, as we can see the use of terms in Turnitin in these AI detectors in our policy papers as well. And all these very punitive discourse could place students in a position of potential distrust and then reinforcing the assumption that they are trying to cheat using AI. So I think moving forward, it would be good if we could have more inclusive language use in policy text. It would be good if we could have more successful example showcasing of students' work that exemplifies originality and responsible AI use. And also I think it would be good if we could have diverse pathways of assessment tasks for students to create original work and so move beyond these essays. So as my final ending, I found this quote from Thompson and colleague really powerful. So they're saying, we tend to hold authors to the same standards of originality and authenticity without considering the significant impact that technology has on the creative process. I think this very well captures the situation and circumstances we're in at the moment, right? Right, finally, some shameless self-advertisement. I've mentioned some of my work in the previous presentation, and if you're interested, feel free to take a photo of this slide, and most of them are open access and free for download on the internet. Right, and this is me, and I just want to finally acknowledge these funders for supporting my work mentioned in this presentation, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was brilliant. So we have a few questions coming up in the chat, and I'm sure there'll be more. The first one is from Lorene, and she was interested in unskilled student use. She said, this seems to be the majority I see. How much skilled versus unskilled use is out there, do you think? And this was referring to the slide where you were looking at skilled use of student AI being very agentic.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm happy to explain more on the data we have. It's actually a very small scale longitudinal study. It's very challenging to recruit participants, to be honest, given the sensitivity of this topic. So in total, we have around 11 students, and then we trace them for a semester. Regarding the we did not really label them as unskilled or skilled students in our paper, but we're merely describing that these are some of the trends that we found in their dialogue patterns. So regarding the so-called unskilled, I would say when we look at these students' chat record, their interaction with AI is on a single turn dialogue pattern. For example, they ask GPT a question, and then GPT gives them an answer, and then they move on to another question. So the conversation is really short, and they are more or less likely treating ChatGPT as a knowledge provider. And when we look at the nature of their questions, it's really very information focused. For example, could you tell me the year when the Great Wall was built? Things like this. But when we look at students that were, I won't say labeled, but we identify could have more sophisticated patterns of AI use, how they engage with a topic is really through extended dialogue. They keep asking different questions, and then the questions they ask are also beyond asking for information. There's a lot of self-regulation. What do you think of this? Well, I don't agree with some of the points you said. Could you clarify further? Could you have more explanation regarding this and that? So when we look at their chat record, we can really see a lot of the independent thinking that goes into their interaction with ChatGPT, rather than seeing ChatGPT as like a Wikipedia thing. Can you tell me this? Can you tell me the year when this bridge was built? Things. I hope this helps.
So do you have a sense what kind of proportion of each that we might be seeing?
Right. I think I won't be able to pinpoint an exact proportion, because mainly this is a very small scale study, and many of our students are from the education related disciplines. If I have to pinpoint a proportion, I think that would be 1 or 2 students out of 11 that I would say have this kind of competent, sophisticated AI use. But by saying that, I think I have to be very cautious to say that this is a very small sample study, and there are inherent bias in sampling and all that as well. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that leads to a related question. So in my last university, we had a copy and paste rule. So students were not allowed to copy and paste from AI. They were allowed to use AI to kind of help them with their ideas, but they weren't actually allowed to then copy and paste that in their assignment, or at least that was the rule. Do you have any thoughts about whether it's legitimate for students to copy and paste versus write something themselves, get feedback from AI, and then kind of adjust their output according to what AI tells them? Do you have a sense of kind of spectrum of what is legitimate practice?
Right. Thank you, James. I think for me, it would be really, I would go with a more radical idea. I think it would be really difficult to pinpoint a one-size-fits-all answer. For me, I would say my go-to approach would be to look at the validity of the assessment task as an assessment scholar. For example, in my context, I'm teaching a digital innovation course, and then the students are invited to produce digital prototypes, and then at the end, they are asked to produce a report. And a lot of these students, they have English as their second language. They have wonderful ideas that they have shared during the class process, but sometimes language is an issue that prevents them from, producing the final report to very clearly articulate their thinking. So in that case, I said it's okay to use GPT for language polishing. And for that purpose, that would necessitate some copy and pasting because they're using it for polishing purposes. In that case, I would say it's legitimate because my main assessment goal and learning outcome for that course is to really look at their design thinking process and then the prototype they're making, rather than assessing the grammatical skills and whether they're capable of forming really beautiful, really well structured English sentences. But I can imagine that if I'm a teacher, say teaching academic writing or English literature, then this would really severely interfere with my learning goals and the validity of this assessment task. Then I would say copy and pasting. This is a no, this is not okay.
Okay, great, thank you. So let's open up the questions to both presenters, and carry on asking in the chat, and feel free to come on microphone if you've got a question for either of our presenters. So we had another question from Matt Brenner. Are there studies or experiences on proactively and transparently using rubrics as a guide for study assignments, where the use of AI is mentioned to achieve improved study results and as an assessment template? So maybe not a question you can answer very easily, Jess, but are you aware of any studies using rubrics to guide assignments?
Right, sorry, James, I think my internet was a little bit off. Could you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, so Matt Brenner was asking, are there studies or experiences on proactively and transparently using rubrics as a guide for study assignments, where the use of AI is mentioned to achieve improved study results? So I guess kind of guardrails to help students understand how they can be using AI in an assignment. Have you come across anything like that?
Well, I don't have a specific study in mind that I know of, explicitly research the use of rubrics, but I might be able to share a little bit more on the paper I mentioned earlier about teachers grading practices, because one of the findings that we found was that in a lot of these rubrics, how students use, non-use, or different extent of use is factored into teachers' grading process is often not clearly presented in the rubrics. For example, in a rubric, we said, students, you need to have critical thinking, but does this mean critical thinking, that you have independently on your own, that you can have this kind of critical thinking without, relying on any AI tools? Or does this mean critical thinking with some scaffolding from AI, that the critical thinking that you could demonstrate in this process? So one of the arguments that we have in that paper was that this is kind of like a messy landscape when it comes to these rubrics and grading, and of course the use of language, and is transparency possible for us to really account for how much AI will be factored into the grading process and how we structure our rubrics regarding these areas? I think this will be a very promising area to look into in the future.
Yes. Yeah. Any other questions for either presenter? I've got a bit of a challenging question, Jess. Nowadays, AI has reached the point where we can upload the assignment brief and we can upload the criteria, and it can do a really, really good job at producing an answer. So, you know, we've got, on the one side, we've got the students who prompt and iterate and have a dialogue until they get it right, and that might be just as demanding as writing it yourself. How do we differentiate between the students who are doing that and the students who are taking a much more kind of shortcut approach? Or do we need to differentiate?
Well, that's a very challenging question. I may not have a very perfect answer at the moment. For me, I think Elaine also mentioned, Elaine has raised her hand, I think, has briefly mentioned in her presentation about the two-lane model, the secure assessment and then the open assessment. And I think the lens that we just talked about, validity, could be a quite good criteria when it comes to these questions. I remember there's a very good paper led by Thomas Corbin from Deakin University, where he talked about structural changes of assessment and discursive changes of assessment. So when we ask students to use AI for example, brainstorming, for language polishing, but on the other hand, we can't really prove whether they have only use AI for these purposes. We cannot really prove whether they have copy and paste it. And they're arguing that these changes that cannot be enforced is meaningless, cheap, talk is cheap. And then they're arguing for a more structural change to assessment. So I guess, yeah, I may not have a perfect answer to your question, but I think that structural change paper, the two-lane approach, and then the validity viewpoint could be some pointers when we start to think about these questions.
Yeah, great. That is a very good paper. And I didn't see who put their hands up first, but we've got Elaine who has her hand up, and Kate. Was Elaine first?
I'm happy for Kate to go. I've done a lot of talking, but just quickly, I'll just add to what Jess has said. I mean, I just think the question about, you know, can students do this? Can they just put the question and the rubric in and get spit out a good answer and then submit that? Like, I mean, that's been possible before AI, right? Okay, to go to the cheating companies, to go to the, you know, go to your friend and borrow theirs or last year's version. So I don't think anything's really changed. Maybe it's making it easier to do. Maybe before it was more costly and more effort required. But at the end of the day, I guess we have to think about, like, that any kind of assessment that can be done with, it's not secure, right? Insecure. So we just have to design around that and make sure that's going to happen. If we allow that to happen, it's going to happen, and it's probably happened anyway. But, you know, if we're doing regular touch points, and I take up a comment that somebody mentioned earlier about over-assessment, I totally agree. Like, we do use that word over-assessment, but we need just lots of opportunities for students to get feedback. If they choose not to take it and they choose to cheat, however you want to frame that, then at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to lose out, right? And they're adults and they have to make those informed decisions.
Yeah, great point. So we've come to 9 o'clock. So I understand that some colleagues may need to leave for their first morning meetings or their first morning teaching. But if anybody wants to stick around for a little bit and continue the discussion, that would be great. I can stick around for a little bit. So if you've got time, please do. And Kate, you had a question.
Yeah, probably more linking back to some of the chat from earlier, and I'm still get a little astounded that the lack of discussion about learning when we're talking about assessment. And Jess, you flagged about the using it for polishing and that's okay. And it just brought me back to that discussion about the nested assessments, and ultimately what happens in school-based practices is you are with students and you do get to see the various drafts, so you get to catch them learning along the way. So I'm interested in your perspectives on kind of that. I can't remember who phrased it. I know someone phrased that term, coined that a phrase or whatever, of catching them learning. And I think we kind of keep losing sight of that sometimes.
Isn't that kind of the whole assessment of learning and assessment for learning, and the summative versus formative?
Yes, and I think that's probably where my question then goes. We talk about over assessment or not enough assessment or whatever it might be, but what are your views about? I mean, there's very clear definitions, I suppose, of the formative and the summative, but actually if it's about the learning aspect and providing that feedback, then that dichotomy becomes a little, I don't know, whether does it become less useful?
Yeah, good point. I guess that's the whole programmatic assessment approach, right? So whereby we can do lots of learning and feedback on that learning, but securely assess or summatively assess at certain points in the program. So the learning should be happening along the way. It's just about when we decide to capture the format of that learning. Sorry, I probably haven't answered your question at all, just made it more complicated.
No, that's fine. And it's been well, for those in Australia, it's a long day. So thank you. I'm happy to leave it there.
Can I add something? I'm not sure that I get Kate's question right, but I think a useful lens to look at this is that we see assessment with different purposes, right? Assessment for learning, assessment of learning, assessment as learning. So when you talk about how we distinguish learning from assessment, and I think that these different assessment for, of, and as learning provides us with different anchors when we think about and when we talk about and how we design assessment for students.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a question from Elia, which is for Elaine. If Elaine, you've still got a little bit of time, are there studies where over-assessment in higher education programs has been replaced with more authentic learning outcome-linked assessments?
I can't really quote any studies off the top of my head, but yeah, I guess it's that whole portfolio type collection of evidence where students get some choice around how to, which elements to choose or to select to contribute to how they evidence their learning through, say, any portfolio. I know health disciplines tend to do this really well already, health and medical subjects often as well. But I don't know, Jess should probably be better able to provide an example of a study.
Also, I can't think of a specific study in my head because research tends to be slower considering the publication process and all that. I think there are positive changes happening in institutions and how assessment is being replaced with more authentic and learning outcomes. I don't have a specific paper in mind, but I think there are some quite some good examples with different universities online that we could go for a search, and then there are, I think, would be more useful information than looking at research paper for that particular question.
Yeah, quite a few scholars have suggested nested or portfolio assessment as a way to go forwards to secure the more kind of traditional assignments. David Bowd has done a presentation where he talks about that, and so has David Carlis. So you might look up those presentations to get a sense of what they suggest there. Okay, our numbers are dwindling. So does anybody else have any questions, or should we let our wonderful presenters go and rest, because it's been a long day for both of them, I think. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of the session then. Matthew, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you very much. I've put my contributions into the text chat. Just as a reminder, the recordings, text chat and slides will be available shortly at the Transforming Assessment website. Other than that, thank you very much for joining, folks. I will send an email out to those who are registered to our mailing list when this is ready. So thanks very much for coming along, everyone.